For the past year, Althea woke to the silence where her husband's and son's laughter should be. The official report called it a tragic accident, a capsized boat on Lake Merrimac during a father-son fishing trip. But when a local dive club discovers a modern safe chained to the murky lake floor, Althea feels the first flicker of doubt. The safe belongs to her husband, and she knows the combination isn't a birthday. It's the date he first lied to her. Every story has a turn no one saw coming, and this one is just beginning. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a gut feeling that something just wasn't right, a feeling you couldn't ignore. The years since they disappeared had passed in a blur of hollow moments. Althea existed in a house that was no longer a home, but a museum of a life that had been abruptly canceled. Mornings were the worst. She'd lie in bed, her body braced for the sound of her 10-year-old son, Caleb, thundering down the stairs, followed by the deeper, rumbling voice of her husband, Garrett, telling him to slow down before he broke his neck. But the sounds never came. There was only the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Each tick a reminder of a second she was living without them. The police had been kind but firm. Sheriff Brody had sat at her kitchen table, his hat in his hands, explaining how the currents on Lake Merrimac could be treacherous. They found a piece of Garrett's small fishing boat, a splintered section of the hull, washed up a mile from where they'd put in. There was no other sign. No bodies. No life vests, just a tragic accident, he'd said. A rogue wave, perhaps, or a sudden squall. Althea had nodded, accepting the logic because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. She packed their things away, unable to bear the sight of Caleb's baseball glove on the counter or Garrett's work boots by the door. She held a memorial service without a casket, staring out at a sea of sympathetic faces who couldn't possibly understand the gaping void in her soul. Then came the phone call. It was a Tuesday, exactly 1 year and 1 week since they'd vanished. It was a new detective, a man named Harding. His voice was younger, more energetic than the weary tone of the retired sheriff. He told her a local dive club, doing a routine cleanup of the lakebed, had found something. He asked if she could come down to the station. When she walked into the small, sterile room, she saw it sitting on a metal table, dripping water onto a plastic tarp. It was a medium-sized digital safe, scarred with rust, but otherwise intact. A thick industrial chain was wrapped around it, secured with a heavy padlock that had been cut by the divers. Althea's breath caught in her throat. "Do you recognize this, Mrs. Thorne?" Detective Harding asked gently. She could only nod. It was Garrett's. He kept it in his home office, bolted to the floor of the closet. He told her it was for important documents, passports, birth certificates, the deed to their house. Harding's expression was serious. "Can you think of any reason why your husband would chain his safe to the bottom of Lake Merrimac?" Althea shook her head, her mind reeling. It made no sense. "We need to open it," Harding continued. "Do you know the combination?" A cold dread washed over her. For a moment she didn't. Garrett had always been private about it, but then a memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. It was from 2 years ago. Garrett had told her he was going on a weekend business conference in Portland. He'd kissed her goodbye, his briefcase in hand. But that Sunday, she'd seen a charge on their credit card statement from a fancy hotel in their own city, just 30 miles away. When she confronted him, he'd spun a story about the conference being moved at the last minute, about wanting to surprise her. She knew he was lying, but she'd chosen to believe him because she loved him, and she couldn't bear the thought that he would betray her. The date of that hotel charge flashed in her mind. August 14th. Try 081419, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The detective keyed in the numbers. There was a soft electronic beep, and the handle turned. The heavy door swung open. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken questions. Althea felt a terrifying glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a year. Not hope, but the dark, dangerous need for the truth. Inside the safe, there was no money. There were no passports or deeds. There was only a small, hard plastic, waterproof box. Detective Harding, wearing latex gloves, carefully lifted it out and pried it open. Nestled inside on a bed of foam was a cheap, disposable burner phone and a slim black ledger, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. The official story of a boating accident evaporated from the room, replaced by a much darker reality. Harding looked at Althea, his eyes conveying a new level of seriousness. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "I think we need to talk about what your husband really did for a living." Over the next few hours, the station became a hive of activity. A tech expert was called in to analyze the burner phone, while Harding carefully turned the pages of the ledger with a pair of tweezers. Althea sat in a nearby chair, feeling like a spectator at the excavation of her own life. The man she had been married to for 15 years, the man she thought she knew, was a stranger. The phone didn't take long to crack. It contained only a handful of text messages and a single contact saved under the initials SB. The messages were brief and cryptic. "Payment received. The package is secure. Meeting changed to the 12th. The usual spot." The last message was dated the day before Garrett and Caleb went on their trip. The ledger was more revealing. It was filled with Garrett's neat, precise handwriting. It listed dates, dollar amounts, and notes that made no sense to Althea. Merrimac site, soil samples, EPA regs, final delivery. But one name appeared over and over, next to the largest payment amounts: Silas Blackwood. Althea's heart hammered against her ribs. Silas Blackwood was a name everyone in town knew. He was a wealthy, powerful real estate developer who had transformed their sleepy region with luxury housing developments and golf courses. He was often celebrated as a local hero, a job creator, but Garrett had always spoken of him with a quiet contempt. "He builds his castles on rotten foundations," Garrett had once muttered, after reading an article praising Blackwood's latest project. At the time, Althea had dismissed it as professional jealousy. Garrett was a small-scale contractor. Blackwood was an empire builder. "We know who SB is," Harding said, breaking the silence. He pointed to the name in the ledger. "The texts were sent to a number registered to a shell corporation, a corporation owned by Silas Blackwood." He leaned forward, his voice low. "Althea, did your husband have any business with Mr. Blackwood?" "No," she said, shaking her head. Garrett would never have worked for him. He hated everything the man stood for. Harding sighed. "Well, it looks like he was taking his money. A lot of it." The implication hung in the air. Her husband, the honest, hard-working man she'd loved, was an extortionist. The thought was so vile, so completely at odds with the Garrett she knew, that she almost laughed. But the evidence was there, sitting on the table in front of her. Harding advised her to go home, to let them handle it. He told her not to approach Blackwood, that the man was dangerous. But Althea couldn't just go home and wait. Garrett hadn't been a criminal. She knew it in her bones. There had to be another explanation. That night, sleep was impossible. She went into Garrett's home office, a room she hadn't entered since his disappearance. She ran her hands over his desk, his chair, trying to feel some connection to him, some clue to the secret life he'd been living. In the back of his desk drawer, beneath a stack of old blueprints, she found a folder labeled Merrimac. Inside were newspaper clippings about Blackwood's most controversial development, a luxury community built on the northern shore of the lake. There were also printed articles detailing environmental regulations for construction sites and printouts of chemical compound names she didn't recognize. Garrett hadn't been an environmentalist, but he had been meticulous. He believed in doing things the right way. As she pieced it together, a new theory began to form, one that painted a very different picture of her husband. He wasn't blackmailing Blackwood for greed. He had discovered something Blackwood had buried. The next morning, she got a call from Detective Harding. His voice was urgent. "We got a hit on the burner phone's location data," he said. "On the night your husband and son disappeared, that phone was active for 2 hours at a location on the lake. It was at a small, private cabin. We just ran the property records, Althea. It's owned by Silas Blackwood." The cabin. The usual spot. It wasn't an accident. It was a meeting. Against every warning from Detective Harding, Althea knew what she had to do. She couldn't sit by while strangers tried to piece together the last moments of her family's life. She got in her car and drove toward the north shore of the lake, toward the luxury development, toward Blackwood's cabin. She needed answers, and she had a feeling they were waiting for her in that cabin by the water. She found the access road easily, a private gravel path marked with a no trespassing sign that she ignored. The cabin was small and secluded, nestled in a grove of pine trees with a private dock stretching out into the water. It looked peaceful, idyllic. Her hands trembled as she got out of the car. She told herself she would just look around the outside, see if she could spot anything. But as she approached the front door, she saw that it was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she stepped inside. The air was stale and musty. The cabin was simply furnished: a small kitchenette, a dusty sofa, a stone fireplace. It looked like it hadn't been used in months. But Althea's eyes were drawn to the hardwood floor in front of the fireplace. There was a long, dark scuff mark, as if a heavy piece of furniture had been dragged across it. And near the hearth, she smelled something faint but unmistakable: the sterile, chemical scent of bleach. Her heart pounded in her chest as she knelt down, her fingers tracing the edges of the fireplace stones. Something was wrong here. She could feel it. She reached her hand deep into the chimney flue, feeling around in the cold, sooty darkness. Her fingers brushed against something small and hard, wedged between the bricks. She pulled it out. It was a small plastic fishing lure, painted bright green with black stripes. Its colors were partially melted and charred from the heat of a fire. It was Caleb's. He'd made it himself the week before the trip, painstakingly painting on the stripes. He'd been so proud of it, calling it his secret weapon for catching the biggest fish in the lake. He would never have left it behind. They were here. Both of them. They had been in this room. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel outside made her jump. Headlights swept across the cabin's interior. Althea scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. It had to be the police. Harding must have followed her. But when the car door opened, the man who stepped out was not wearing a uniform. It was Silas Blackwood. He walked toward the cabin with a confident stride, but his face registered surprise, then cold fury when he saw Althea standing in the doorway, clutching the charred fishing lure in her hand. "You shouldn't be here," Blackwood said, his voice dangerously calm. His eyes flickered from her face to the lure in her hand, and in that moment, all pretense of civility vanished. He knew who she was, and he knew why she was there. They were here, weren't they? Althea's voice shook, but she stood her ground. "My husband and my son." "What happened in this cabin?" Blackwood took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "Your husband was a fool," he said, his voice a low growl. "He got in over his head. He found some old shipping manifests from a chemical company I used to own. Found out we cut some corners on waste disposal years ago. Buried some drums on that land before I built on it. He thought he could make me pay." "It wasn't about the money," Althea shot back. "He wanted you to clean it up. The ledger, the notes. He was documenting everything to force you to do the right thing." A bitter smile twisted Blackwood's lips. "The right thing? There's no profit in the right thing. I agreed to meet him, to pay him off and make him go away, but he brought the boy, and a tape recorder." His confession came out in a torrent of angry, self-pitying words. He explained how he'd met Garrett and Caleb at the dock, how they'd come into the cabin. Garrett had tried to get a recorded confession. A struggle broke out. It spilled out of the cabin, onto the dock, onto the boat. "It was an accident," Blackwood insisted, his eyes wild. "He went for me. We struggled. The boat capsized. It all happened so fast. I never meant for the boy to get hurt." "Liar!" Althea screamed, the word torn from her throat. As Blackwood advanced on her, his face contorted with rage, the sound of multiple sirens sliced through the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees surrounding the small cabin. Detective Harding burst through the door, his weapon drawn. "It's over, Blackwood," he yelled. "Step away from her." Blackwood froze, a cornered animal. It was then that he finally broke. He sank to his knees, his confession turning into a desperate, rambling plea. He told them everything. How he'd pulled their bodies from the water that night, how he'd taken them far from the lake, burying them on the same contaminated land he'd been trying to protect. A final, sick irony. In the weeks that followed, Althea felt as though she were moving through a waking nightmare. They found Garrett and Caleb right where Blackwood said they would be. She was finally able to give them a proper burial, to say a real goodbye. The trial was swift. With Blackwood's confession and the evidence from the safe, he was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The story of his environmental crimes came to light, sparking outrage and a massive federally mandated cleanup of the site. The truth, when it finally came, was more painful than she could have ever imagined. Garrett hadn't been a simple contractor, nor was he a criminal. He was a flawed, decent man who had stumbled upon a great evil and tried to fight it alone, using the only weapons he thought he had. In doing so, he had made a terrible miscalculation that had cost him and their son everything. A year later, Althea stood on the shore of Lake Merrimac. The water was calm, sparkling under the afternoon sun. The silence was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer a hollow void of the unknown, but a quiet space filled with memory and a painful, hard-won peace. She had sold their house and used the money, along with a settlement from Blackwood's now bankrupt company, to start a foundation in Garrett and Caleb's names, an environmental watchdog group dedicated to protecting the community from corporate greed. She had found a new purpose, forged in the heart of her tragedy. Her husband was gone, but his fight, the one he had died for, was now hers. So, what do you think? Was Garrett a hero for trying to expose a dangerous man, or did his choice to blackmail him, involving his son in the process, make his actions reckless? Share your thoughts below. If this story made you think, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates a mystery that unravels piece by piece. Thanks for listening.